Welcome to Face to Face. This is a show about change and what's next. It's a show that asks questions and peels back the layers of our average everyday experience and goes beyond scratching the surface. We interview people doing incredible things who are making a difference around the globe. Join me as we listen in and get one step closer to understanding that big ideas shared create collaboration. Collaboration can inspire community, and communities create social change. I'm David Peck, and this is Face to Face. Lauchlin Munro is the director for the International Development Studies program at the University of Ottawa, and we met recently and had a great chat. I think you're going to really enjoy this podcast. We talked about evidence-based policy making. We talked about methodological and ideological baggage that donors bring to the table when they do development. We talked about the difference between theory and practice, and we talked about what's just and what's moral and what's equitable and what's acceptable as a general rule. Sort of this idea that those kinds of things do sort of cross cultures in every way. And we talked about we covered a lot of ground in this interview. I think you're going to really enjoy it. We took analogies apart. My brother calls me an analogy snob, actually, but Lauchlan certainly took down a few analogies as well. We talked about gross national happiness. Lauchlan was a guest at the Beyond GDP conference that I was involved in a few months ago, and we talked about things like national income accounting and so on. Like I say, we covered a lot of ground. I think you're going to really enjoy it. Check it out. Don't forget to check out davidpecklive.com. My book, Real Change is Incremental, is available now, as is my latest collection of essays called Irreconcilable Differences. Check it out. Thanks again for listening to Face to Face, and stay tuned. Well, welcome to Face to Face. We are joined today by Dr. Lauchlin Munro. He is the director at the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa. Lauchlin, thank you for joining us today.
Great to be here.
Yeah, it's I every time I interview, I've done. I think I just mentioned to you before the tape recorder went on, we're at about 105 interviews, and I think I've said every interview we've had a really interesting guest here today. But I don't know if that's just because I don't have anything all that creative to say, or if I truly continue to meet really interesting people, and I think it's the latter. So you got quite a history, and it sounds like a lot of loves and a lot of interests. You want to talk about Zimbabwe today. Maybe we're going to bring that up. Some things about evidence and maybe empiricism. Maybe we'll get into that debate. But I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your time too, when you were vice president of IDRC. International Development Research Council here in Canada. Center, doing some I would imagine some pretty interesting things, and I'd love to hear a little bit about there versus here, now that you're directing this School of Development Studies. Maybe you could talk a little bit about some of those differences.
It was a bit of a change, but then again, I expected it was going to be a change. I mean, the International Development Research Centre is a Canadian federal crown corporation. It's a corporation that's owned by the government of Canada, but not run by the government of Canada. So it works at sort of arm's length, and it promotes rather than does research in developing countries. So its role is to support researchers in and from developing countries to work on practical problems in environment, economic policy, social policy, technology, that sort of thing. Then I moved here, and now I'm the director of Canada's largest school of international development studies. So we have, about 800 students, 700 undergrads roughly, 110 or so master's students, and 17 Ph.D. students.
Wow.
In a brand new...
That's a big program.
That's a big program, yeah. And it's going to get bigger because we're only in the second year of our Ph.D. program.
Okay.
So, and it's an interdisciplinary PhD that combines the theory of international development with policy and practice of international development. Those are both compulsory courses the students have to take. And it's a bilingual program, and it's an interdisciplinary program, so, and it's designed as an interdisciplinary program from the ground up, just like all of our programs. So it's very interesting, very different now being in a university where we're actually doing the teaching and doing some of the research ourselves. But nonetheless, the contacts and the experience from my 9 years at IDRC have been very valuable. And I've been able, I think, to some extent at least, along with my many colleagues here, to link town and gown.
Town and gown, nice. Intimately linked, it seems to me. A lot of connections. What I really need to know, and I think the most important question is, did you have as nice of an office at the IDRC as you do here at the University of Ottawa?
Well, I think...
We're surrounded by windows, looking out over Ottawa. It's just a gorgeous day.
Yeah, you should see the view in January.
Yeah, that's probably...
No, actually, all the directors in the Faculty of Social Sciences have the same view, except some of them have a little bit lower,
lower view,
and some are higher. I'm on the 8th floor of a 15-story building, so I got a pretty good view.
Yeah. I went to the elevator that only went to 6 floors, and I said, "Damn it, I'm in the wrong building."
No.
So tell me, Lauchlan, about theory and practice, or theory versus practice, or theory over practice.
Yeah, this is the eternal debate. I mean, the way we've structured our programs here at University of Ottawa is we like to say we combine theory and practice. But that, when you say you combine theory and practice, it's always at the risk of creating a dualism. There's theory and there's practice. And I'm just finishing a review of an article, that sort of proposed article for a Canadian journal that's criticizing universities for teaching too much theory and not enough practice.
Right.
The person never says what they mean by theory or practice.
Interesting.
And never defines what's meant by practical. Now, a colleague of mine at the school made a very good point the other day to me, and she said, teaching good writing skills, good clear writing skills is an important practical skill, but you can teach that in a course that's labeled development theory, or you can teach that in a course that's labeled methodology, or you can teach that in a course that deals with substance, like environmental issues in Africa. So we like to combine theory and practice. Those of us who teach in the Ph.D. program, there's those of us who teach the policy and practice course. I teach that. There are my colleagues who teach the theory course. But we always have every year a good discussion at the beginning, trying to not so much delineate the two courses or separate them, but to try to build intersections between them and try to show the students how what they learn in the theory is actually very useful and practical in analyzing concrete situations.
Would you say that my background's philosophy, would you say that a more academic program on development is more about the philosophy of development to some degree? I mean, a course like policy and practice, your course, I mean, obviously could be incredibly practical if you were a person who was going to be sitting behind a desk, hanging out and helping to develop policy. I mean, you need good writing skills to develop good policy, right?
And you need good analytical abilities to dissect a problem. And
different than, I think often when we think of practical, we think of carpentry, right? Carving some chess pieces. That's practical work, isn't it? Or as an agricultural, you've got the hoe out, you're planting seeds.
Well, I used to work in East Africa, and Uganda and Kenya at that time had the highest rate of deaths by traffic accidents in the world. And it was very interesting because Kenya generally had good roads at that time on which you could drive very quickly, and Uganda had very bad roads on which you couldn't drive very quickly, but they both had horrendously high mortality rates from traffic accidents. So, a theoretical training in research methods helps you figure out, well, okay, here's a problem, high rates of death from traffic accidents. Let's break it down. Is it safety regulations? Is it the role of the police? Is it the state of the roads? Is it speeding? Is it alcohol and driving? What is behind this horrendously high rate of carnage on the roads of East Africa? So, on one level, that's a very practical issue.
Happening in an office with lots of windows, but it's going to have a real practical implication on the ground.
Yeah.
Do you find that your students prefer the dualisms?
I think like all our students like most students in social sciences, our students don't generally love the research methods courses, but we insist on them. In our undergraduate program, we make them do a couple of qualitative research methods courses. We make them do a good old-fashioned statistics, introductory statistical analysis course. We insist on that. They have to do a really practical course on project management, because if you're going to do, no matter what you do in life, knowing how to run a project, whether it's in the public or the private or the non-profit sector, knowing how to run a project is a useful skill. But yeah, we also have more theoretical courses for them to offer. The students keep telling us they want more of the practical skills. But sometimes I'm not quite sure what they mean by practical skills. Right. And it's clear that project management fits into that, but teaching them how to write clearly or teaching them the basics of statistical analysis, I think those are immensely practical and important skills.
One of the things that I've been sort of hammering on lately is this idea of listening. And, I do a lot of sleight of hand magic, card tricks and coin tricks and things. And there was a famous magician who said, and I'm sure I've said this on an interview before, but said that 3 things you need to be a good sleight of hand magician. You need to practice, and you need to practice, and you need to practice. And so I've taken that and said, as a good development worker in my classroom at Humber College, I've said, you need to listen, and you need to listen, and by the way, you need to listen.
Yeah.
How much development is listening? How much of it, from your experience, you've got, on the ground, you've got the practical experience. Now you've got the theoretical. You're bringing the two together. We talked about connections with the IDRC. How much of all this is about just me sitting on this side and listening to the Zimbabwean on the other side, or the Cambodian on the other side of the table, and trying to bridge that gap?
Well, that's one of the great challenges, because donors tend to arrive in these countries with a preset package of tools. Nice. Which Jim Armstrong calls the standard model in his book Bright Spots, that was published about 2 years ago. And he's a guy you should interview, by the way.
What's his name?
Jim Armstrong, The Governance Network.
I'll put a link to that in the blurb on your interview as well. Bright Spots is
Bright Spots is the name of the book. Palgrave Macmillan. Anyways, donors tend to arrive in these countries with what Jim Armstrong calls the standard model of, results-based management and breaking the problem down. But they also arrive with an implicit cultural or ideological toolkit related to words like good governance and human rights and institutions. These are all the buzzwords of development these days. And it's often hard to translate some of those words into other languages. I mean, I teach the policy and practice course at this university in French, and I have a great deal of trouble translating phrases like evidence-based policymaking into French. In fact, the major article on French on that topic is called Le evidence-based policymaking, pourquoi s'y intéresser? Even the experts in France use the English in the French.
Sure.
I imagine, and French and English are languages that are quite close in many respects. I mean, imagine trying to translate all these concepts into Khmer or Shona.
Oh, there are no Khmer words for certain things.
And I remember in Zimbabwe 20 years ago, we started looking into how do you talk about child rights in Zimbabwe, and in deep rural Shona-speaking areas, they said, well, they had real trouble with this notion of rights, that children had rights, but they had a perfectly clear understanding that parents have a duty to look after their children, or guardians elders of the community have a duty to look after their children. So that plays well into the rights logic, where every there's a duty bearer for every rights holder. So instead of emphasizing the rights holder, which is what UNICEF headquarters wanted us to do, we started talking about the duties of the duty bearers, of the parents and the elders of the community. So that was a good example, I think, of us listening. We could have tried to invent a Shona word for rights and try to ram it through and see what the heck came of it. But I think a lot of donor organizations have difficulty because they arrive with so much baggage, the methodological baggage of results-based management, and then the implicit ideological and cultural baggage that's embedded in words like good governance, institutions, human rights. And it's important to listen to the people at the other end to see how they come at those same issues. Because almost every culture, or every culture I've ever met, has some sort of sense of what's just, what's moral, what's equitable, what's acceptable. And I think that's pretty universal in human society. The question is, well, how do you bridge the gap between those notions of justice or acceptability or equity and our concepts of human rights and democracy and good governance?
Yeah, I mean, it's so cliche to say the white guy in a culture like that tends to be seen as the person with the answers. Well, they're rich, they made it, they figured it out.
Oh, but there's increasing skepticism in the developing world
I think so too.
About that model, and you know, the rise of China over the last 20, 30 years has made people question that. I mean, you know, China has grown at an average of what, 8 or 9% GDP growth. I know GDP isn't everything, but listen, 8 or 9% GDP growth over a generation transforms a society, an economy, a nation completely. And it has transformed China, and the world has seen that. And at the same time, you know, the United States and Western Europe, Japan, Canada, we've been bumbling on, and in a good year we get 2.5% GDP growth. And, you know, that simple fact alone causes a lot of people, a lot of educated people in developing countries to say, well, your recipe gets me 2.5% and their recipe gets me 8 or 9%.
Yeah, I think I'll go with that one.
I may discount what you say as a result.
Why isn't GDP everything?
Well, GDP measures the value of goods and services exchanged in a society. So, I mean, there's a whole bunch of assumptions there. Only things that are exchanged in a market count. You know, the British economist Alfred Marshall told the famous story about the English gentleman who, his wife died. He was a widow, and being an English gentleman, he didn't know how to do the housekeeping, so he hired a woman. Other things being equal, the British economy grew as a result of him hiring that woman. The English gentleman then fell in love with his housekeeper, married her, stopped paying her, and GDP suffered as a result. But the amount of work done in the house was the same all the way through.
Right.
So there's the limitations of what's produced and exchanged in the market, and, you know, the productive activities inside the household are not counted in GDP. That's number one. The feminists have been banging on that drum with very good reason for 40 years. GDP, whenever I teach national income accounting, I say GDP or GNP are almost unique in economics because it's the only time we tell our students that the gross is more important than the net. Throughout economics, it's drilled into you that net is more important than gross. We're not interested in the firm's net total revenue, gross revenue. We're interested in its net revenue. In other words, its profit. We're not interested in the gross amount of investment. We're interested in the amount of investment minus depreciation, so that's net investment. We do this in one area after another in economics. The only area where we forget that is in national income accounting, where we count gross national product only, net of any damage that growth does to the environment, to society, to social relations.
So full cost accounting in a sense.
There's no GDP is not and does not pretend to be, and even its founders, Simon Kuznets, made clear that it was not anything close to full cost accounting. The third reason that GDP isn't everything is, well, Amartya Sen has been saying this for 30 or 40 years, that, you know, it only measures our power over commodities, and the valuable things in the world are not just commodities that we can purchase in a market place. The valuable things in life are to be healthy, to be literate and numerate, to have positive social relations with one's family, friends, and neighbors and other community members. It's to be healthy, to avoid preventable early death. Those are the important things in life, and GDP doesn't measure those things.
So we met at the Beyond GDP conference in Toronto and Humber College just a couple of months ago. Actually, two and a half months ago. Former Prime Minister of Bhutan, Ron Coleman, various academics coming together, and practitioners. Actually, here we go again through practice to talk about gross national happiness. You've said before to me that you're a fan of GNH. Gross national happiness, or that maybe that's not a fair paraphrase, or that you're interested in it.
I'm a fan of it to the extent that it identifies a very real problem. And the very real problem is that gross national product or gross domestic product doesn't measure everything that's important for the reasons that I've said. The Bhutanese have, the king in 1980 came up with this phrase, gross national happiness is more important than gross national product. The important thing to note is that initially it was just a play on words. He was making a rhetorical point.
Right.
And for years, indeed decades, the concept sort of lay dormant, got no traction in the Bhutanese government or anywhere else. It was a sort of an intellectual curiosity that lay around. In the last 15 years, since about 2000, the year 2000, the Bhutanese government's gotten very serious about promoting gross national happiness as the sort of official governing ideology of the Bhutanese state. And so they're saying, yes, material prosperity is important, but also the preservation of the national culture is important. The preservation of the natural environment is important. The psychological well-being of the citizens of the country is important. All those things are, to my mind, unobjectionable. I have a little bit of a worry about the way the Bhutanese interpret preserving the national culture, because they have a very particular idea of what the national culture is.
Right.
And it's essentially the culture of 4 or 5 valleys in western Bhutan. I mean, Bhutan's a very plural society, as the former prime minister admitted in his speech, that, there's 9 or 10 or 11 different languages, not dialects, mutually unintelligible languages spoken in Bhutan, and 3 major religions, Buddhism, Bonism, Hinduism, and lots of syncretic combinations of them. And trying to say there is a single national culture to be preserved is, well, I have my doubts and skepticism about that.
Some problems.
Yeah.
Do you, Naomi Klein says that the free market is kind of, wired up like a crack addict. I mean, is that why it's so difficult for the overarching sort of ideological nature or edge to the free market, to capitalism, to actually think about the other in these ways? Because isn't that really what we're talking about? We're talking about an economic system that's going to take other people into consideration, which it seems to not do, really, for the most part.
Well, there are capitalisms and there are capitalisms, both historically and today. And I think you can see a sort of aggressive state capitalism in countries like Russia, which is a model I'm not terribly happy with. It's based around a national security state, a very nationalist, at times borderline racist ideology. You have a very different type of capitalism in China, which is very creative in some ways and has brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty over the last 20 or 30 years, an undeniable achievement. But it has bought it at the price of what? Massive destruction of the physical environment, the groundwater, the soils, the air in China. And then you have, the Swedish Nordic capitalism, which is, more sharing and caring. And then you have intermediate capitalisms like you see in the UK or Canada and the United States. So I'm one of these guys who always looks and says, okay, let's take big concepts like capitalism and break them down a bit. Because which capitalism are you talking about? And also, the capitalism of the post-war era from circa 1946 to 1975 was a very different beast. It was much more regulated. It was much more national, nationally based, and therefore easier to regulate than this highly globalized, financially driven capitalism that we have now. And that was, of course, the other thing. In the capitalism of the post-war 30 years after 1945 was heavily based around production, not finance. Is one of the things that we've seen since the financial reforms of the 1980s is the financialization of capital and capitalism, where you can make money without making anything.
Right.
and this has been a long, you can find references to this in Hilferding 100 years ago, and Marx before that, and Ricardo before him, but it has reached a scale that where finance is more important than production in a lot of schemes.
Do you believe in trickle-down economics? Do you believe that, the free market, whatever that means, what did Chesterton say, that the free market doesn't exist because it's never actually been tried, right? Kind of like the Churchill comment about democracy and so on. But do you believe in that notion that, if you and I sit in our ivory towers and make lots of money, it's going to eventually get to the people?
The analogy is, and the World Bank used to use this analogy a lot, a rising tide raises all boats.
Yes.
Well, the fact of the matter is some boats are leakier than others. Some boats have good anchors and some don't. Some boats have trained helmsmen, others don't. Some boats, there's nobody in them.
That's right.
Listen, it's very hard to find an example where there was strong economic growth and everyone got, and identifiable groups got worse off. There are a few examples historically. Brazil in the 1960s and early 70s had a huge growth spurt, and there's pretty good evidence that things got worse for the urban working classes and other poor classes in Brazil at that time. There's pretty good evidence that at a certain period of the Industrial Revolution in the early mid-19th century that the working class got objectively worse off in a number of indicators in industrial Britain. Those are the exceptions. Usually growth is either neutral to the poor or has some marginal effect in bumping them up. What's really important, though, is to notice that there are some forms of growth that are much more efficient in reducing poverty than others. Compare India and China over the last 30 years. India's grown a little bit slower than China, sort of 5, 6, 7%, as opposed to the 8, 9, 10, 11% that China's grown. So that's part of the story too. But also, the Indian growth was very inefficient in reducing poverty. In technical terms, the poverty-reducing elasticity of growth was very low. And that's in part because the sources of growth in India were in things that didn't employ a huge amount of labor. They were in things like IT and services, whereas Chinese, it was manufacturing and construction and infrastructure, which employ huge numbers of people. So the same amount of growth in China got you a lot more poverty reduction than it did in India. And again, you can multiply that comparison over time and space. What's key about growth is that some of it is better, certain forms of growth under certain economic regimes are better at reducing poverty than others. Key question for policy is, well, okay, how do we try to rig the conditions so that our growth is more poverty reducing? And Canada in the last 30 years has been spectacularly poor at that.
You anchors, some boats are empty, some are leaky. I mean, you're really picking apart the analogy.
Well,
was the World Bank listening? To come back to our earlier comment about, sitting on the other side of the table and trying to bridge the gap. Is it possible that sometimes the economic system or the policymakers or the councils around the world are using their poor analytical skills that they didn't get in the theoretical programs that they should have been taking?
I think the World Bank is a lot different from the World Bank of 20 or 30 years ago. I think it's very different, in fact. I remember 10 years ago I went to CETA. When I was still at IDRC, I went to CETA with my colleague Rohinton Medora, who was Vice President of Programs at IDRC, and François Bourguignon, who was then Senior Vice President and Chief Economist of the World Bank, was giving a talk at CETA about the World Development Report. And he was talking about development in technical terms, Senian freedoms. So, I mean, he read Amartya Sen, and he fully embraced this idea that growth was not everything, and that issues like health and nutrition and literacy and numeracy and social cohesion and good quality of governance were important. I mean, that's not something you would have heard at the bank in 1995.
Right.
He said that in about, it was somewhere mid-2000s. Now, just 2 years ago, the World Development Report on Jobs, and one of its key authors is Gordon Betjeman, who's probably the most interesting labor economist of his generation, another guy you might want to interview.
Okay.
He was one of the lead authors on that report. And basically, it turns labor market theory on its head. It's a very interesting, very important report because it says jobs, we used to treat jobs as the residual, do the investments, make sure there's growth, and jobs will follow. Well, that was a lot like trickle-down economic growth theory. What Gordon and his colleagues did, and this has been peer-reviewed by a committee of 9 eminent economists, including a Nobel Prize winner, is that he said, no, actually, you should start with the jobs. If your objective is to grow employment, then start with that. And they found examples and policies and structures and ways that you can actually make sure that it's jobs that are driving the economic agenda, not growth that may or may not lead to jobs further down the line. And that was a World Bank report you would never have got out of them in the 80s or 90s. Or even 50.
I love these conversations because they could go anywhere, and I'd love to talk to you. Maybe even briefly. Maybe we can come back to it as well. I want to get to Zimbabwe because I think it's one of your passions and something you've been thinking about for years. And let's talk about kids and health and all those wonderful things that need to be addressed. Can you just really quickly say, so in 95, you wouldn't have read that at the World Bank. And I think that's great. I think it's exciting. It's not pessimistic. It's not cynical. It's hopeful. Mm-hmm. I don't know, maybe we're two idealists here. We're carved from the same stone to some degree. But I'd like to call myself a hopeful cynic, and I have many times before.
Yeah, I'm a hopeful cynic and a practical optimist.
Are people changing, or are people's ideas about people changing?
Hard to say. I think several things are at play. As Keynes told us in a book called The General Theory,
like
it's.
I can't interview him. Can I?
No, he's been dead too long. In the long run, it is ideas for good or worse that matter, and I think the weight of ideas, and I'm not.
That's a great phrase.
It's not just the weight of evidence, and I think there's an increasing weight of evidence behind that intuition of Amartya Sen about, health, education, literacy, numeracy, social cohesion, social solidarity being important, being the core of development rather than increased command over commodities as represented by growth. There's a huge weight of evidence about the importance of those things. That has built up over 30 years. But it's, and it's also the ideas, the great theorists, the people like Keynes and like Amartya Sen, who have been banging on this for years. And it doesn't hurt that someone like Amartya Sen won the Nobel Prize in economics.
Right.
That definitely helps. But also other eclectic economists, I'm thinking of Elinor Ostrom and John Williamson, who won in, I think, 2009 for their work on institutions, and how cooperation can evolve even in the absence of central authority imposing cooperation, which is a finding that flies in the face of a lot of what's taught in game theory courses in university and elsewhere. But, she did a lifetime to demonstrate that, as long as people can talk to each other, we're not condemned to the tragedy of the commons, that common property resources are not inevitably condemned to be overconsumed, that people can get together and work out institutions to govern them, and they do.
And as ideas sort of press down on you, and new ideas press down on you, or Pascal said there was nothing really, I guess a biblical notion, I suppose, of Ecclesiastes, nothing new under the sun. But he said what is new is when you connect the ideas.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in that way, people are kind of changing, I suppose, or at least their approach to development, their approach to economics, their approach to the environment does seem to be getting better.
Well, one of the really interesting things that's happened in universities, not just in the Western world, but around the world, and again, the last 20 or 30 years, is we're getting out of the box that we built ourselves in the late 19th century. In the mid-late 19th century, we divided the world up into what came to be known as disciplines, academic disciplines: biology, chemistry, physics on the natural sciences, political science, sociology, economics, anthropology, psychology in the social sciences. And we actually call them disciplines because to understand, you have to, the process of getting your mind around thinking like an economist is you get disciplined to think that way.
Well, it's like a vertical now, right?
Yeah. But, one of the things we've discovered is that, the world, those are convenient ways of thinking about the world for a long while, and they helped a certain amount of scientific progress. But nowadays, and especially in fields like public policy and international development, the problems we face don't fit neatly into any of those boxes. The problem is not just economic, it's also environmental. It's not just environmental, it's a public policy program. It's a problem of how we've designed our institutions. And so the solution to an environmental problem isn't just going to be introduce a new technology. It isn't going to be just market the next widget, that technology to solve it. It's going to be, how do we create an institutional environment where that technology can thrive and be used. And
so way more relational too.
Well, really, it is. It's more relational.
Cooperative, integrated.
It's cooperative. It's integrating. It's relational. It's interdisciplinary. So in the last 20 or 30 years, you've seen a huge growth in things like schools of public health, institutes of environmental studies, schools of international development, schools of global affairs, schools of public affairs. And in all of these, you find people from a variety of different disciplines, and often not just from social sciences, but from social and natural sciences. So that division, long artificial division, is breaking down as well. And so an Institute of the Environment, you'll typically find geographers and, oceanographers, climatologists, but economists, rural sociologists, and the like. Schools, my school, a very concrete example, my school, International Development and Global Studies, we have, let me see, Ph.D.s in management, political science, economics, geography, education, law, philosophy. I'm sure I'm missing someone, but that just gives you an idea of the breadth within my school alone. Yeah. And this has been the wave of the last 20, 30 years in academia, is that we started breaking down these disciplinary boundaries that we built in the 19th century, and we started creating actual academic units. At the University of Ottawa, we call them schools. Elsewhere, they call them institutes, whatever, where teaching and learning is taking place in an interdisciplinary fashion, because the world is just too complicated to be stuck into a box that's called economics or geography or political science.
Tell me about the complicatedness, like nature of working in Zimbabwe, and you said offline to me that things really haven't changed there in some 25 years.
Well, they have, and
they have, and they haven't.
Yeah, Zimbabwe is a deeply paradoxical country. From 1890 to 1980, it was a quasi-apartheid state. It was, run by and for a very small white minority who did everything from rig the electoral system to rig the land ownership system to building infrastructure that went, build the railway so it went past the white farms and not past the black farms. Literally rigged the whole thing from the beginning. And then independence in 1980. And yes, there were important problems in Zimbabwe in that first decade after independence. There were important ethnic strife and massacres in the south. I don't deny that. But overall, the government in the first 10 years of independence in Zimbabwe made some very good decisions. The number of kids in primary school doubled in a decade. The number of kids going to secondary school increased tenfold. They greatly expanded public health and nutrition programs and immunization programs, and the results were there. The literacy rates went up, the immunization rates went up, life expectancy went up, infant mortality went down, under 5 mortality went down. They invested quite smartly. And if you read the UNICEF documents of that period, the 80s and the early 90s, and even if you read Amartya Sen's and Jean Drèze's work on Zimbabwe, very complimentary about all this, this reasoned investment in social development, in health, education, nutrition, literacy. This was at a time when the rest of Africa was in crisis, and a lot of these indicators in the rest of Africa were going in the opposite direction. They were getting worse in the rest of Africa, for the most part. Then the polls reversed, and most of the rest of Africa improved, starting in the late 90s. It's not often known, but GDP growth in Africa for the last 15 years has been positive, even in 2009 after the recession. The African economies are growing faster than in the last 15 years than any of the major traditional donor countries have grown. And other social indicators are improving in Africa. Not as fast as we'd like them, but they've been improving. Problem is Zimbabwe just went into the tank starting around the late 1990s. And they had enormous difficulties, violence, a very violent and chaotic land reform, an HIV/AIDS epidemic that the government ignored for too long and didn't do enough about, hyperinflation. I mean, the second highest rate of inflation that humankind has ever seen. I don't know if you saw it as you came in to my office, but on my office door, there's a $1,000 trillion bill from Zimbabwe.
I need to get a selfie with that later. I need to tweet that later.
Right, 100.
Say it again. A one?
I think it's $1,000 trillion bill.
It's hilarious.
I mean, you can buy them on eBay for about $10.
Wow.
But
which is so funny that you can buy it for $10.
Yes, I know.
Is that Canadian or American?
I haven't actually gone on eBay. A friend of mine told me.
So Lauchlan is...
so Zimbabwe went into this, they got out of the trough in about 2009. They mastered the inflation. They got rid of the Zimbabwe dollar. They adopted the US dollar as the currency for the country. And a measure of stability has returned, a measure of economic growth. But for children in Zimbabwe, the literacy rates, the immunization rates, the mortality rates are still where they were in the late 1980s. And so there's sort of 25 years, a whole generation, where the rest of Africa was making progress for most of that, and that Zimbabwe hasn't.
Is this a comment on how interconnected all these things are really? Is that what this is about? Or is, you talk a lot about evidence-based?
Well, some things are interconnected and some aren't. When a crisis hits a country like Zimbabwe, something that deep, when you have, prices literally going up 1,000% per day, you can't run a school system, you can't pay public servants. Everything's going to go into the tank. And then add on to that an HIV/AIDS epidemic that was amongst the 5 worst in the world. Add on to that a high degree of polarization politically, a high degree of political violence. Nothing's going to go well when the situation is that bad. Everything tends to spiral downwards. But it's interesting, their next door neighbor, Zambia. When I lived in Zimbabwe in the 90s, everyone looked down at poor Zambia. Zambia had a really rough ride in the 70s and 80s, and we in Zimbabwe like to sort of look down our noses at our northern cousins there. And now the polls have reversed.
Right.
And it's Zambia that, I'm not saying Zambia is heaven on earth. I'm not saying they've got out of out of all their problems. But, they've had fairly steady, decent progress for most of the last 20 years.
So what do you do with, and I'm going to say the conservative rant, and that's probably way unfair, it's polarizing, and I should know better, but the rant that says, it's corruption, look at this guy, look at what we read about this guy in the newspaper, and it's all top down, and if we could get rid of this guy, put a few new politicians in place, everything's going to be fine. Okay, massive.
Listen, corruption's a problem in Africa, no doubt. Corruption's a problem here in Canada. Corruption's a problem in the Western world. Look at the financial crisis that we saw in 2008 and tell me that wasn't corruption on a grand scale. Come on. And we're all paying for it.
Yep.
We in Canada,
globally,
fortunately, a little less, but, if I were a British citizen and, I had, my taxes were going to bail out the City of London for that, that was corruption. The case of Ireland in the economic crisis. The biggest Irish bank, when it exploded in the financial crisis, 50% of its loan book was to 10 individuals. Where was the regulator? Where was the chief risk officer? Where was the internal audit?
Define check and balance.
Yeah, this is rampant corruption and cronyism, and the political class in Ireland were in it up to their teeth. So. Yes, there's corruption in Africa, but let's not pretend that this is an African or a third world problem.
Do you think on some level it's just another way of absolving ourselves of some sort of moral responsibility?
Well, it's always good to point the finger at someone else. Right. And we, as I say, the donor countries, when they go to developing countries, they tend to go with their baggage of tools and their ideology, and they sort of say, well, our way is the best.
Well, I've been kind of wondering lately too with some donors that I know personally who, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, right? So, RBM, and isn't it about impact, and what are your outcomes, David, on this, and tell me more about that. And really it's back to the discipline conversation, the vertical. It's just been turned horizontal. Right? Causal logic is just disciplinary in a different way, right?
It's certainly a disciplining logic. Well, yeah, I teach RBM in my results-based management in my class, and I teach the critique of it as well.
Nice.
Results-based management, I like to distinguish between three types of phenomena. There's the simple, there's the complicated, and there's the complex. Okay? RBM is really good for the simple. Okay? Baking bread is simple. Okay, there's a recipe. This type of flour, this type of baking soda, this much salt. You combine them in a certain way. You bake them for a certain amount of time in a tin of the right size at a certain temperature, and the result is predictable every time.
Right.
Complicated. Okay, sending Neil Armstrong to the moon was complicated. You needed the disciplinary expertise, the skills of mathematicians, engineers, physicists, medical doctors, all kinds of different, 16 different types of engineers, electrical, mechanical, structural, etc., etc. And everything had to be done with very, very fine tolerances. The margins for error on everything were extremely slim. But once you had the system down, you could send a man to the moon whenever you wanted, practically. That's complicated. Complex, raising a child is complex. Every child is different. The experience you gain from the first child is only applicable to some extent to the next child. The fact of the second child changes the environment for the first child, so the initial conditions are no longer the same. You have the two children learning from each other and adapting to each other in addition to adapting to you, the parents. You now have a complex system. And a lot of the important public policy issues we deal with, financial instability in a crisis, climate change, international peace and security, to name only three top-of-mind issues, they're complex issues. Results-based management is great for the simple, and it's great for the complicated. It's useless and dangerous for the complex.
Wow, we need more time to do another interview just on that alone. We do have to wrap it up here shortly, and I'm sorry about that. But tell me, I mean, I hear the passion in your voice. You spend a lot of time on the ground. Your whole life has been about the splash and ripple effect. How's that? Sorry about the RBM metaphor there. But why, pray tell, why the heck do you care? It sounds like you really do. This is not just an exercise for you.
No,
This
it's
is
not just an
another
exercise
essay.
for me.
This is not another publication.
No, I don't know.
Right?
I credit my grade 2 primary school teacher, Mrs. Campbell. Yeah,
That's awesome. What's her name?
Mrs. Campbell.
Mrs. Campbell.
Forget her first name.
Grade
I
two?
never knew. Grade 2.
I think mine was Mrs. Pruder. If
I
you can believe
dedicated my Ph.D. thesis to her,
that.
and
That's
she
awesome. Very neat.
she had taught in Guatemala.
Oh, okay.
And she had slides of this little village at the foot of a volcano in Guatemala, and she got me interested in this stuff, and I never stopped being interested in foreign countries, in geography,
Amazing.
and
Getting a shiver.
intercultural issues. I credit her.
That's amazing. I mean, I don't know of a better way to end our interview. I mean, my whole sort of project's about the little things, you know, the domino effect, you know, we're all one domino, we can knock another one down. We've all got a role to play, our part to play. The little things make a big difference and so on. But wow, Mrs. Campbell, I mean, not alive today?
I have no idea.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
I have no idea.
The point? Isn't that marvelous? That in a way you don't even know. And I think the impact that we all play every day, the handshakes, the classrooms we're in front of and so on, I think is remarkable. Lauchlan, thank you so much for joining me today. And
My pleasure.
Lauchlin Munro, the director of the School of International Development and Global Studies. Please check out the University of Ottawa's program online. We'll have lots of info for you. We'll do an interview. We'll do another one for sure.
Okay, I look forward to it.
Yeah, thank you.